The limestone courthouse steps seemed to stretch endlessly upward as Helena Vasquez clutched her worn leather briefcase and took her first deep breath of the morning air. Somewhere out there, perhaps in your own city or town, people were starting their day with coffee and optimism, but Helena knew this Tuesday would either vindicate 15 years of her life or destroy everything she had left to lose. Have you ever walked into a room where everyone already decided you don't belong? Share in the comments where you're watching from today, because this story of justice might just remind you that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how many people try to bury it. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 14 opened to reveal a sight that would have made most people turn and flee. Marcus Blackwood, her husband of 16 years, sat at the plaintiff's table surrounded by what looked like a small army. His mother Cordelia Blackwood held court at the center, her pearl necklace catching the fluorescent lights as she whispered instructions to various family members. To her left sat Marcus's father, Theodore Blackwood, a man who had built a construction empire and never let anyone forget it. The Blackwood siblings formed their own intimidating cluster. Brother Vincent with his expensive suit and perpetual sneer, sister Anastasia whose cold beauty had always made Helena feel inadequate, and younger brother Damien, who despite being 35 still sought his mother's approval in everything. But the family tree didn't end there. Uncle Reginald Blackwood, Theodore's brother who owned half the commercial real estate in the county, commanded attention from the second row. His wife Beatrice sat beside him, her lips pursed in the same disapproving expression she had worn at every family gathering Helena had ever attended. Cousin Nathaniel, who had somehow parlayed a small inheritance into a chain of restaurants, gestured animatedly as he spoke with Cousin Gabrielle, whose interior design business catered to the same wealthy clients who now filled this courtroom with their united front of hostility. Even the extended family had shown up. Great-Aunt Millicent, who at 82 rarely left her mansion except for the most important occasions, sat regally in her wheelchair with a nurse attending her every need. Her grandson Oliver, fresh from his Harvard MBA, looked every inch the golden boy the family had groomed him to be. The message was unmistakable. The Blackwoods were united, powerful, and absolutely certain of their victory. Helena's footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet as every head turned toward her. She had dressed carefully in her best navy suit, the one she had worn to her wedding 16 years ago and altered twice since then when money was too tight for new clothes. Compared to the designer outfits surrounding Marcus, she might as well have worn burlap. The whispers started immediately, a low hum of voices that followed her down the aisle like a wake of judgment. I always knew she was trouble, Cordelia murmured just loud enough to be heard. Some people will do anything to get their hands on what doesn't belong to them. Vincent leaned over to whisper something to his brother-in-law, and both men chuckled softly. Anastasia examined her manicured nails with the practiced indifference of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Even the court reporter seemed to regard Helena with curiosity, as if wondering how this solitary woman planned to face down what appeared to be half the city's elite. Helena took her seat at the defendant's table, the empty chairs beside her emphasizing her isolation. She opened her briefcase with steady hands and began arranging her papers, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the meticulous organization of her files and the way she seemed to know exactly where everything was located. Her movements were precise, economical, like someone who had spent considerable time preparing for exactly this moment. The Blackwood family's lawyer, Richard Sterling, arrived with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case that mattered. His reputation preceded him into every courtroom, and today he practically glowed with anticipation. Sterling had built his career on high-profile divorces where wealthy families needed protecting from what he liked to call opportunistic spouses. He shook hands with each Blackwood family member like a general reviewing his troops before battle. "Marcus," Sterling announced loud enough for Helena to hear, "we have assembled quite an impressive array of witnesses today. Your family's willingness to speak truth about your wife's character should make this proceeding remarkably straightforward." Theodore Blackwood nodded approvingly. "We've all seen how she operates," he said, "always lurking around the edges, taking notes, asking questions about things that were none of her business. A man builds something with his own two hands, and suddenly everyone thinks they deserve a piece of it." The irony wasn't lost on Helena. though she gave no outward sign of having heard the conversation. She continued organizing her papers with the same methodical precision, occasionally making small notations in the margins of documents that seemed to stretch back years. To any casual observer, she looked like a woman in over her head, preparing inadequately for a battle she couldn't possibly win. When Judge Patricia Hendricks entered the courtroom, the assembled crowd rose as one. Judge Hendricks was known for her no-nonsense approach to domestic disputes and her particular distaste for cases where one side attempted to overwhelm the other through sheer numbers rather than merit. She surveyed the packed courtroom with interest, her experienced eye taking in the obvious wealth and coordination of the plaintiff's supporters. "Mrs. Vasquez," Judge Hendricks said, using Helena's maiden name as listed in the court documents, "I see you're seated alone at the defendant's table. Do you have legal representation, or will you be representing yourself in these proceedings?" Helena rose with quiet dignity, her voice steady despite the weight of dozens of hostile stares. "Your Honor, I will be representing myself today. I believe I'm adequately prepared for these proceedings." Sterling couldn't suppress a small smile. "Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to note for the record that we have assembled what we believe to be comprehensive testimony regarding the defendant's character and behavior throughout this marriage. We're confident that the evidence will speak for itself." Judge Hendricks nodded slowly, her expression giving away nothing. "Very well, Mr. Sterling. However, I should remind all parties that the strength of testimony lies not in its quantity, but in its veracity and relevance to the matters before this court." As the judge spoke, Helena made one final notation in her file and closed it with a soft snap. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps anticipation. But it was gone so quickly that anyone who noticed might have convinced themselves they had imagined it. The battle lines were drawn. On one side sat the combined might of one of the county's most powerful families, backed by unlimited resources and unwavering certainty in their cause. On the other side sat a woman who had been dismissed, underestimated, and written off by everyone in that room. What none of them realized was that Helena Vasquez had been preparing for this day far longer than any of them suspected, and she had learned long ago that the most dangerous opponent is the one everyone believes has already been defeated. The first witness Sterling called was Theodore Blackwood, and the patriarch of the family approached the witness stand with the bearing of a man accustomed to having his words carry weight. At 71, Theodore still possessed the broad shoulders and calloused hands that had built Blackwood Construction from a single truck operation into the largest contracting firm in 3 counties. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit impeccably tailored, and his expression carried the gravity of someone about to deliver unpleasant but necessary truths. After being sworn in, Theodore settled into the witness chair with practiced ease. This was a man who had testified before city councils, zoning boards, and regulatory commissions for decades. He folded his hands and looked directly at Sterling, pointedly avoiding any glance toward Helena's table. "Mr. Blackwood," Sterling began, "you've known the defendant for approximately 16 years, correct? Could you describe your observations of her character during that time?" Theodore's jaw tightened, as if the very question pained him. "Mr. Sterling, I've built my reputation on being a fair judge of character. In my business, you learn to read people quickly because your livelihood depends on knowing who you can trust. From the moment Helena entered our family, I sensed something calculating about her nature." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the silent courtroom. She had a way of inserting herself into conversations about business matters that didn't concern her, always asking questions about contracts, about finances, about decisions that were frankly above her level of understanding. "My son Marcus is a trusting soul, perhaps too trusting, and I watched her exploit that kindness systematically." Sterling nodded encouragingly. "Did you observe specific instances of this behavior?" Theodore's voice grew more confident as he warmed to his theme. Family dinners became exercises in manipulation. She would ask seemingly innocent questions about upcoming projects, about our relationships with subcontractors, about financial projections. At the time, we attributed it to curiosity, but looking back, it's clear she was gathering intelligence for her own purposes. Helena continued taking notes with the same methodical precision she had displayed throughout the morning. Occasionally, she would nod slightly, as if confirming some private understanding. To the casual observer, her behavior might have seemed like that of someone who knew she was beaten and was simply going through the motions. The witness continued his testimony with growing animation. She had a way of making herself indispensable to my son while gradually isolating him from his family. Suddenly, Marcus was too busy for family gatherings, too tired for business discussions, too distracted to maintain the relationships that had sustained him his entire life. When a woman systematically dismantles a man's support system, Mr. Sterling, that's not love. That's strategy. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Sterling's satisfaction was evident in his tone. No further questions. Judge Hendricks looked toward Helena's table. Mrs. Vasquez, do you wish to cross-examine this witness? Helena rose smoothly, carrying a manila folder that she opened as she approached Theodore. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but perfectly clear. Mr. Blackwood, you mentioned my interest in business discussions. Do you recall our conversation on March 15th, 2 years ago, about the Riverside Development Project? Theodore's confidence flickered slightly. I'm sure we discussed many projects over the years. Helena withdrew a document from her folder. This is the contract for that project, signed March 20th. Would you mind identifying your signature on page 12? As Theodore examined the document, a subtle change came over his demeanor. His shoulders seemed to settle slightly, and when he looked up at Helena, something had shifted in his expression. Yes, that appears to be my signature, he said, his voice noticeably quieter than before. Helena retrieved the document and returned to her table without further questions. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. No further questions at this time. The change in Theodore's demeanor hadn't gone unnoticed by his family, though none of them could quite interpret what had just occurred. Marcus leaned over to whisper urgently to Sterling, but the lawyer seemed equally puzzled by the brief exchange. Sterling's next witness was Cordelia Blackwood, and Marcus's mother approached the stand with the regal bearing of someone who had never doubted her place in any hierarchy. Her testimony followed a similar pattern to her husband's, but with a more personal edge that spoke to years of carefully cultivated resentment. Mr. Sterling, Cordelia began before being asked a question. I want this court to understand that I tried to welcome Helena into our family. I truly did. But some people simply don't have the breeding or the character to appreciate what they're being offered. She adjusted her pearl necklace with perfectly manicured fingers. Helena never understood her place in our family structure. She would arrive at social gatherings dressed inappropriately, speak out of turn during important conversations, and worst of all, she seemed to take a perverse pleasure in making other family members uncomfortable with her questions and observations. Sterling guided her through specific examples, each one painting Helena as an outsider who had never truly belonged and had used that position to manipulate situations to her advantage. Cordelia's voice grew more strident as she described what she characterized as years of passive-aggressive behavior designed to undermine family unity. The most telling incident, Cordelia continued, occurred at last year's Christmas gathering. Helena brought a recording device to dinner, claiming she wanted to capture family memories. But I noticed she only seemed interested in recording certain conversations, particularly those involving business matters. When I asked her about it, she became defensive and evasive. That's when I realized we were dealing with someone who had been planning something for quite some time. Helena's pen moved steadily across her notepad, but her expression remained neutral. If Cordelia's testimony was causing her any distress, she gave no outward sign of it. Sterling concluded his questioning with obvious satisfaction. Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. Your willingness to speak truthfully about these difficult matters is commendable. When Helena rose for cross-examination, she carried a different folder this time. Mrs. Blackwood, you mentioned last year's Christmas gathering. Do you recall who was present at that dinner? Cordelia's answer was swift and confident. The entire family, of course. It was one of our most important traditions. Helena nodded thoughtfully. And do you remember the recording device you mentioned? Of course I do. It was completely inappropriate. Helena withdrew a small digital recorder from her folder and placed it on the witness stand. Is this the device you're referring to? Cordelia examined it briefly. Yes, that appears to be the same type of device. Helena retrieved the recorder and looked directly at Cordelia. Mrs. Blackwood, that recording device was a Christmas gift from your son Marcus to me. He specifically asked me to use it to capture family stories for a memory book he wanted to create as a surprise gift for you and Mr. Blackwood. Were you aware of his request? The color drained from Cordelia's face as she processed this information. She looked toward Marcus, who had suddenly found something fascinating about his hands. She began, then stopped. Marcus never mentioned any memory book to me. Helena's voice remained gentle. No further questions, Mrs. Blackwood. As Cordelia returned to her seat, the whispered conversations among the family members took on a different quality. Doubt had entered the equation, and with it came the first cracks in their unified front. Vincent Blackwood took the stand next, his testimony focusing on what he described as Helena's attempts to turn Marcus against his family. According to Vincent, Helena had systematically poisoned his brother's mind against family traditions and business practices that had served the Blackwoods for generations. She was always filling his head with ideas about doing things differently, Vincent testified. Suddenly Marcus was questioning decisions that had made our family successful for decades. He started talking about transparency in business practices, about documenting everything, about treating employees differently. These weren't Marcus's ideas, Mr. Sterling. These were Helena's ideas, planted deliberately to disrupt our family harmony. But when Helena cross-examined Vincent, she produced a series of emails that showed Marcus had been expressing concerns about certain business practices months before his marriage to Helena. The emails, sent to Vincent himself, detailed Marcus's growing unease with what he perceived as ethical shortcuts that could eventually damage the company's reputation. Vincent's confident testimony crumbled as he was forced to acknowledge that his brother's concerns had predated Helena's influence by a considerable margin. Like his father and mother before him, Vincent left the witness stand looking confused and considerably less certain than when he had begun his testimony. Anastasia Blackwood's turn came next, and her testimony painted Helena as a cold, calculating figure who had never shown genuine affection for anyone in the family. According to Anastasia, Helena had maintained a facade of friendliness while secretly documenting family conversations and gathering information that could later be used against them. She never really laughed at our jokes or seemed genuinely interested in our lives, Anastasia told Sterling. Everything felt performative, as if she were studying us rather than trying to become part of our family. A normal sister-in-law would have confided in me, would have sought my advice about marriage and family matters. Helena kept her distance and her secrets. But Helena's cross-examination revealed that Anastasia had never once invited Helena to any social activity, had never called her for advice, and had explicitly excluded her from several family events during the early years of her marriage to Marcus. When confronted with evidence of her own exclusionary behavior, Anastasia's characterization of Helena as antisocial began to seem less like insight and more like projection. As witness after witness took the stand, a pattern began to emerge that even Judge Hendricks couldn't ignore. Each family member delivered testimony that sounded remarkably similar in structure and focus, as if they had all attended the same coaching session. More troubling still, Helena's brief cross-examinations were systematically undermining the foundation of each testimony with documents and evidence that the family clearly hadn't expected her to possess. Marcus watched his family's coordinated attack with growing unease. What had seemed like an insurmountable advantage was beginning to feel more like a house of cards, and Helena's quiet confidence was becoming more unnerving with each passing hour. The morning recess had done nothing to ease the growing tension in Courtroom 14. As the proceedings resumed, Judge Hendricks called for the continuation of witness testimony, but Helena Vasquez rose from her seat with a composure that seemed to have solidified during the brief intermission. Her movements were no longer those of someone simply going through the motions, but rather of someone who had been waiting for precisely this moment. "Your Honor," Helena said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "I would like to recall Theodore Blackwood for further cross-examination, if the court permits." Sterling immediately objected. "Your Honor, the witness has already been examined and cross-examined. The defendant had her opportunity to question Mr. Blackwood." Judge Hendricks looked thoughtfully at Helena. "Mrs. Vasquez, do you have new matters to address with this witness?" Helena opened a different folder, this one notably thicker than the others she had used. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe there are significant factual errors in Mr. Blackwood's testimony that require clarification." The judge nodded. "Mr. Blackwood, please return to the witness stand. You're reminded that you're still under oath." Theodore approached the witness stand with considerably less confidence than he had displayed during his initial testimony. The brief interaction with Helena during his first cross-examination had clearly unsettled him, though he couldn't have explained exactly why. As he settled into the chair, he avoided looking directly at either Helena or his family members, focusing instead on Judge Hendricks with the expression of a man hoping for protection that might not come. Helena approached the witness stand carrying what appeared to be a substantial contract. Mr. Blackwood, during your earlier testimony, you characterized me as someone who gathered intelligence about your family's business for my own purposes. Do you recall making that statement? Theodore shifted uncomfortably. Yes, that's an accurate summary of my testimony. Helena held up the contract so that both Theodore and the judge could see it clearly. I'm showing you what has been marked as Defendant's Exhibit 1. This is a promissory note dated September 12th, 4 years ago. Would you please examine the signature at the bottom and tell the court whose name appears there? Theodore's face went ashen as he examined the document. The confident patriarch who had delivered such damaging testimony earlier in the day seemed to shrink before everyone's eyes. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. That appears to be my signature. Helena retrieved the document and held it where the entire courtroom could see. This promissory note indicates that you borrowed $250,000 from me personally, not from any bank or financial institution. Is that correct? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Theodore's family members sat frozen, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and confusion. Marcus looked as though someone had physically struck him, his mouth hanging open as he stared at his father. Theodore cleared his throat, his voice gaining slight strength, but losing all its earlier authority. That is correct. Helena moved closer to the witness stand, her voice remaining gentle, but her words carrying devastating precision. Mr. Blackwood, what was the purpose of this loan? Theodore glanced desperately toward his family, then back at Helena. There was a cash flow problem with the Riverside Development Project. The initial funding had been delayed, and we needed bridge financing to meet our contractual obligations. And what would have happened to Blackwood Construction if you had been unable to secure this funding? Theodore's shoulders sagged as the full implications of Helena's line of questioning became clear to everyone in the courtroom. We would have defaulted on multiple contracts. The company would have faced bankruptcy. Helena nodded thoughtfully. And when you approached banks and other traditional lending institutions for this emergency funding, what was their response? 3 banks turned us down within a week, Theodore admitted. The project was considered too risky given the market conditions at the time. So when you were unable to secure funding through conventional means, and your family's business was facing potential bankruptcy, who approached whom about this loan? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Theodore looked down at his hands, his voice barely audible when he finally answered. I approached you. I asked if you might be able to help us. Helena withdrew a second document from her folder. This is the original loan agreement, which specified a repayment schedule over 18 months with 7% annual interest. Can you tell the court how much of this loan has been repaid to date? Theodore's face flushed with what might have been shame or anger or both. None of it. We haven't been able to make any payments yet. Helena's voice remained steady and professional, but her words carried the weight of absolute truth. So to clarify for the court, Mr. Blackwood, 4 years ago, when your family business was facing bankruptcy, I provided you with $250,000 in emergency funding that saved your company. Is that correct? Yes, Theodore whispered. And in the 4 years since that loan was made, neither you nor your family has made any effort to repay even the interest on that loan. Is that also correct? Yes. Helena turned to face the courtroom, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. And yet today, you testified under oath that I was a calculating individual who gathered intelligence about your family's business for my own purposes. Would you like to revise that characterization? The transformation in Theodore was complete. The powerful businessman who had commanded respect and attention was gone, replaced by a man forced to confront the reality of his own hypocrisy. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of its earlier certainty. I think I may have been hasty in my assessment of your motivations, he said slowly. Looking back, you were nothing but generous to our family during a very difficult time. Helena nodded and returned to her table, but she wasn't finished. Mr. Blackwood, one final question. When you asked me for this loan, Did you tell any other members of your family about our arrangement? Theodore shook his head. No. You specifically asked that we keep the transaction private to avoid any awkwardness within the family. So none of your family members, including your son Marcus, knew that I had provided this emergency funding to save the family business? That's correct. We never told anyone. Helena closed her folder with a soft snap that seemed to echo through the silent courtroom. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I have no further questions at this time. As Theodore returned to his seat, the dynamics in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The family members who had sat so confidently throughout the morning now wore expressions of confusion and growing concern. Whispered conversations broke out among them as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. Marcus stared at his father with an expression of complete bewilderment. Vincent and Anastasia exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to question everything they thought they knew about Helena's role in their family's affairs. Even Cordelia, who had seemed so certain of her moral superiority, now appeared shaken and uncertain. Sterling attempted to regain control of the narrative during redirect examination, but the damage was done. Theodore's credibility as a hostile witness had been completely destroyed, and worse still, Helena had established a pattern that suggested there might be more revelations to come. Judge Hendricks watched the proceedings with the interest of someone who had seen many courtroom dramas but rarely witnessed such a complete reversal of testimony. She made several notes before addressing the court. We'll take a brief recess to allow counsel to confer with their clients, Judge Hendricks announced. When we resume, I expect all parties to be prepared to proceed with full knowledge that this court values truthful testimony above all else. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Helena remained at her table, calmly organizing her papers. The transformation was remarkable. The isolated woman who had entered the courthouse that morning had been replaced by someone who clearly possessed both the knowledge and the evidence to challenge every assumption her husband's family had made about her character and her motivations. The Blackwood family huddled together in urgent consultation, their earlier confidence replaced by the growing realization that they might have seriously underestimated their opponent. And for the first time since the proceedings had begun, Marcus looked at his wife with something that might have been recognition, as if he were seeing her clearly for the very first time. When court resumed after the recess, the atmosphere had changed completely. The Blackwood family no longer radiated the unified confidence they had displayed that morning. Instead, they sat in clusters, whispering urgently among themselves with the nervous energy of people who had begun to suspect they were walking into a trap they couldn't see. Sterling called Cordelia Blackwood back to the stand, clearly hoping to repair some of the damage done during Theodore's devastating testimony. If he could re-establish the narrative of Helena as a manipulative outsider, perhaps the morning's revelations could be minimized as an isolated incident rather than part of a larger pattern. Mrs. Blackwood, Sterling began with forced confidence. I'd like to give you an opportunity to expand on your earlier testimony regarding the defendant's behavior during family gatherings and social events. Cordelia had used the recess to compose herself, and she approached the witness stand with renewed determination. Her pearl necklace caught the afternoon light as she settled into the chair, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to and believed. Mr. Sterling, I want this court to understand that our family has always been generous and welcoming to newcomers. We have a tradition of embracing the people our children choose to marry. But Helena never seemed interested in becoming part of our family in any genuine way. Sterling guided her through a series of questions designed to reinforce the image of Helena as someone who had taken advantage of the family's generosity while contributing nothing in return. Cordelia's testimony grew more animated as she described what she characterized as years of one-sided giving with no reciprocation. Helena observed this testimony with the same quiet attention she had shown all morning, occasionally making notes but never seeming distressed by the accusations being leveled against her. If anything, her composure seemed to have strengthened during the recess, as if Theodore's forced admission had confirmed something she had been waiting to demonstrate. When Sterling concluded his questioning, Helena rose for cross-examination carrying what appeared to be a medical file. Mrs. Blackwood, you mentioned that your family has always been generous to newcomers. I'd like to ask you about a specific time when you needed help yourself. Cordelia's confident expression flickered slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. Helena opened the file and withdrew several documents. Do you recall your emergency gallbladder surgery 3 years ago? Of course I remember. It was a very frightening experience. Helena approached the witness stand with a hospital billing statement. This is the itemized bill from Mercy General Hospital for your surgery and recovery. The total amount was $67,000. Do you remember how this bill was paid? Cordelia's face began to pale as she examined the document. Our insurance covered most of it. Helena produced a second document. This is a statement from your insurance company showing they covered $31,000 of the total cost. That left a balance of $36,000. Do you recall how that balance was resolved? The courtroom fell silent as Cordelia struggled to respond. Her voice, when it finally came, was much quieter than it had been moments before. I believe there was some kind of payment plan arranged. Helena withdrew a third document from the file. This is a cashier's check for $36,000, made out to Mercy General Hospital and dated 1 week after your surgery. The purchaser's signature line shows my name. Do you remember me giving you this check? The transformation in Cordelia was immediate and complete. The regal bearing she had maintained throughout her testimony crumbled as the reality of Helena's generosity became undeniable. Her hands trembled slightly as she examined the check. Yes, she whispered. You paid the balance when our insurance claim was denied for the portion they considered experimental treatment. Helena's voice remained gentle, but her words carried devastating clarity. And did you ever repay this money, Mrs. Blackwood? Cordelia shook her head, unable to meet Helena's eyes. No, we intended to, but there were always other expenses, other priorities. Helena nodded understandingly. And when you paid this bill, did you tell any other family members about my assistance? No, you asked us to keep it private. You said you didn't want to make anyone else feel obligated or uncomfortable. Helena closed the file and returned to her table. So to clarify, Mrs. Blackwood, when you characterized me today as someone who never contributed to this family in any genuine way, you forgot to mention that I paid $36,000 for your emergency medical care 3 years ago? Cordelia's voice was barely audible. I suppose I had been focusing on other aspects of our relationship. Helena's expression remained neutral. Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. No further questions. As Cordelia returned to her seat, looking shaken and diminished, Sterling quickly called Vincent Blackwood to the stand. Vincent had spent the recess coaching himself to avoid the mistakes his parents had made, but Helena's methodical destruction of witness credibility had clearly rattled him. Vincent's testimony focused on business matters, characterizing Helena as someone who had tried to interfere with family business decisions without understanding the complexities involved. According to Vincent, Helena's questions and suggestions had created tension and uncertainty where none had existed before. She was always second-guessing our established practices, Vincent testified, asking why we did things certain ways, suggesting alternatives that showed she fundamentally misunderstood how our industry operates. It became clear she was trying to insert herself into decision-making processes where she had no experience or expertise. Sterling nodded approvingly. And what impact did this interference have on family relationships? Vincent's confidence grew as he warmed to his theme. It created divisions where none had existed. Suddenly Marcus was questioning decisions that had made our family successful for generations. He started talking about transparency, about documenting everything, about changing vendor relationships that had served us well for years. These weren't Marcus's ideas, they were Helena's. But when Helena began her cross-examination, she produced a business loan agreement that stopped Vincent's testimony cold. Mr. Blackwood, you mentioned that I interfered with vendor relationships. Do you recall your restaurant equipment financing 3 years ago? Vincent's face went white as Helena placed the document in front of him. This is a loan agreement showing that when your equipment financing fell through 2 days before your restaurant opening, I co-signed a replacement loan for $85,000. Is this your signature beside mine? Vincent stared at the document as if it might disappear if he looked at it long enough. Yes, that's my signature. Helena retrieved the document. And what would have happened to your restaurant if you hadn't been able to secure equipment financing 2 days before opening? Vincent's voice became increasingly quiet. We would have had to postpone the opening indefinitely. We would have lost our initial investment and probably faced bankruptcy. And when you approached banks for emergency financing, what was their response? They all said it was too risky to approve financing so close to opening day. So when traditional financing wasn't available and your business was facing failure, who offered to co-sign the loan that saved your restaurant? Vincent couldn't look at his family as he answered. You did. You offered to help when no one else would. Helena nodded. And in the 3 years since that loan was made, have you made any effort to remove my name from the co-signature responsibility? Vincent shook his head. No. We've been meaning to refinance, but business has been challenging. Helena closed her file. So when you testified today that I interfered with business decisions where I had no experience or expertise, you failed to mention that my financial guarantee saved your restaurant from bankruptcy? The courtroom watched in stunned silence as another witness was forced to completely reverse his characterization of Helena. Vincent's testimony about her interference in business matters now sounded hollow and ungrateful rather than protective and concerned. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, Helena said quietly. No further questions. As Vincent returned to his seat, the pattern was becoming unmistakable. Every family member who had testified against Helena was being confronted with evidence of her substantial financial assistance during their times of crisis. More damaging still, each revelation showed that Helena had specifically asked for discretion, suggesting a level of genuine generosity rather than calculated manipulation. Judge Hendricks observed the proceedings with growing interest. She had presided over hundreds of family disputes, but rarely had she witnessed such a systematic reversal of testimony. The morning's confident accusations were being methodically dismantled by documentation that suggested a completely different narrative. Sterling's strategy was in shambles. His army of witnesses was being transformed into character references for the woman they had come to destroy. And with each revelation, Helena's quiet competence and thorough preparation were becoming more evident to everyone in the courtroom. The Blackwood family sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence, realizing that their coordinated attack had become something far more dangerous. A public accounting of their own ingratitude towards someone who had quietly supported them for years. The afternoon session began with an atmosphere that bordered on the surreal. What had started as a coordinated family assault on Helena's character had transformed into something resembling a public confession booth, with each witness being forced to acknowledge years of hidden generosity they had conveniently forgotten when crafting their hostile testimony. Sterling called Uncle Reginald to the stand with visible reluctance, but the wheels of testimony were already in motion, and stopping now would only make the situation worse. Reginald Blackwood owned nearly half the commercial real estate in the county, and his wealth and influence had always made him one of the family's most formidable members. At 65, he possessed the bearing of a man accustomed to being deferred to in both business and family matters. Reginald approached the witness stand with considerably less confidence than his relatives had shown earlier in the day. He had witnessed the systematic destruction of 3 family members' credibility, and his usual commanding presence seemed diminished by the knowledge that Helena possessed files that apparently contained documentation going back years. Mr. Blackwood, Sterling began with forced optimism. You've known the defendant for 16 years through family gatherings and business interactions. In your observation, has she contributed positively to family unity and prosperity? Reginald shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair, his eyes darting toward Helena's table where she sat organizing yet another folder with methodical precision. His voice lacked the authority that usually characterized his public statements. Well, Mr. Sterling, I think it's important to be fair in these assessments. Helena has always been quiet during family gatherings, perhaps more of an observer than a participant. I wouldn't characterize her as someone who actively sought to build relationships within our family structure. Sterling nodded encouragingly. And in terms of business matters, did you observe any concerning behavior regarding her interest in family financial affairs? Before Reginald could answer, Helena rose from her table. Your Honor, I'd like to save the court some time. Mr. Blackwood, rather than continue with prepared testimony, would you prefer to discuss the Westfield Shopping Center mortgage directly? The effect on Reginald was immediate and dramatic. His face went ashen, and he gripped the arms of the witness chair as if seeking physical support. Sterling objected frantically, but Judge Hendricks was clearly intrigued by this pattern of Helena anticipating witness testimony with specific financial documentation. I'll allow this line of questioning, Judge Hendricks ruled. Mr. Blackwood, you may answer the question. Reginald looked toward his family with an expression that seemed to be asking for forgiveness in advance. Helena, I think we should discuss this matter privately rather than in open court. Helena approached the witness stand carrying a thick mortgage document. Mr. Blackwood, when your shopping center financing was called in early during the banking crisis 5 years ago, and you needed $2.3 million within 30 days to avoid foreclosure, who provided the emergency financing? Reginald's voice was barely audible. You did. You arranged a private loan that allowed us to pay off the original mortgage and avoid losing the property. And what collateral did I require for this substantial loan? None. You said you trusted that the property value would secure the loan over time. Helena nodded thoughtfully. And in the 5 years since that loan was made, how much has been repaid? Reginald looked down at his hands. We've been paying the interest, but the principal balance remains outstanding. Helena returned to her table without further questions. By this point, the pattern had become so clear that Judge Hendricks was making extensive notes about what appeared to be a systematic campaign of financial support that had been deliberately concealed from the court during the initial testimonies. Beatrice Blackwood followed her husband to the stand, but her testimony was markedly different from those who had preceded her. Perhaps recognizing the futility of maintaining false narratives in the face of Helena's documentation, Beatrice chose a more honest approach from the beginning. Mr. Sterling, Beatrice began before being asked a question. I feel compelled to correct some misimpressions that may have been created during earlier testimony. While it's true that Helena has always been somewhat reserved during family gatherings, I think we need to acknowledge that she has been extraordinarily generous to our family during difficult times. Sterling looked panicked. Mrs. Blackwood, please just answer the questions I ask you. But Beatrice continued as if she hadn't heard him. When our son Oliver was applying to graduate school, Helena quietly provided a letter of recommendation that carried significant weight because of her professional connections. She never asked for recognition or thanks. We only learned about it months later when Oliver mentioned it in passing. Helena didn't even rise to cross-examine Beatrice. Instead, she simply nodded acknowledgement as the witness voluntarily provided testimony that directly contradicted the family's coordinated attack on her character. Cousin Nathaniel took the stand next, and his testimony followed a similar pattern of reluctant honesty. Rather than wait for Helena to produce evidence of her assistance during his restaurant chain's expansion 3 years earlier, Nathaniel immediately acknowledged that Helena had provided both financial backing and business connections that had been crucial to his success. I think we all need to be honest here, Nathaniel told Sterling directly. Helena has been the silent financial backbone of this family for years. She's helped every one of us during crises, and she's never asked for public recognition or special treatment in return. What we're doing here today is unconscionable. Sterling was now in full damage control mode, but the avalanche of truth had gained too much momentum to stop. Cousin Gabrielle followed Nathaniel to the stand and immediately began detailing Helena's assistance with her interior design business, including client referrals and emergency funding during a cash flow crisis. Even great-aunt Millicent, despite her advanced age, provided testimony that painted Helena as someone who had quietly arranged for medical care and home assistance during several health scares. According to Millicent, Helena had coordinated with doctors, arranged for private nursing care, and even personally supervised home modifications to ensure the elderly woman's safety and comfort. As witness after witness took the stand, the courtroom began to resemble a testimonial dinner rather than a hostile divorce proceeding. Family members were no longer attacking Helena's character, but instead competing to acknowledge her generosity and support over the years. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table looking increasingly isolated and bewildered. The family army he had assembled to support his case had transformed into character witnesses for his wife, and each testimony made his own position look more untenable and ungrateful. Judge Hendricks called for another recess, but before the courtroom could empty, she addressed both counsel directly. Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Vasquez, I'd like to see both of you in chambers immediately. This case has taken a most unusual turn, and I believe some discussion is warranted before we proceed further. As the courtroom cleared, Helena calmly gathered her files while family members approached her one by one to offer quiet apologies and explanations. The morning's unified front had completely collapsed. replaced by individual expressions of guilt and regret from people who were beginning to understand the magnitude of their ingratitude. Vincent approached Helena's table first. "Helena, I don't know what to say. We never meant for things to go this far. Marcus convinced us that you were planning to take advantage of the family, but now I realize we were the ones taking advantage of you." Cordelia followed, her earlier regal bearing replaced by obvious shame. "My dear, I owe you an enormous apology. You saved my life with that medical payment, and instead of gratitude, I repaid you with suspicion and hostility." One by one, the family members who had come to court to destroy Helena's reputation found themselves instead acknowledging a debt of gratitude that they had somehow convinced themselves didn't exist. The transformation was complete and devastating, leaving Marcus sitting alone at his table while his former army of supporters essentially defected to the other side. Theodore approached Helena last, his voice heavy with regret. "Helena, I've been a fool. You've been the best thing that ever happened to this family, and we've treated you shamefully. Whatever Marcus has told us about your motivations, we should have known better. You've never asked for anything in return for all your help." Helena listened to each apology with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the proceedings. Her responses were gracious but brief, suggesting someone who had expected this moment and was prepared to handle it with appropriate gravity rather than triumph. The recess stretched longer than usual as Judge Hendricks conducted her chambers conference with both attorneys. When court finally resumed, it was clear that the entire dynamic of the case had fundamentally changed. The question was no longer whether Helena deserved consideration in the divorce proceedings, but rather how the court should address what appeared to be a systematic campaign of financial support that had been concealed and then twisted into evidence of manipulation. Sterling returned to the courtroom looking like a man who had been thoroughly outmaneuvered by circumstances he had never seen coming. Meanwhile, Helena sat at her table with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had methodically prepared for this day for much longer than anyone had suspected. When court reconvened after the extended chambers conference, the atmosphere in courtroom 14 had transformed completely. Judge Hendricks returned to her bench with an expression that suggested the private discussion with both attorneys had been illuminating and decisive. Sterling sat at his table looking like a man who had just been thoroughly educated about the difference between zealous advocacy and willful misrepresentation, while Helena maintained the same quiet composure she had displayed throughout the proceedings. "Mrs. Vasquez," Judge Hendricks began, "I understand you wish to make a statement to the court before we proceed to closing arguments." Helena rose from her table with the graceful bearing of someone who had been preparing for this moment for much longer than anyone in the courtroom had suspected. She carried no notes, no files, just the quiet confidence of someone who had finally been given the opportunity to speak her truth after years of silence. "Your Honor," Helena began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the courtroom, "I want to thank you for allowing the truth to emerge today, even though that truth has been painful for everyone involved. 16 years ago, I married Marcus Blackwood because I loved him and because I believed in the possibility of building a life together based on mutual respect and shared values." She paused, her eyes moving across the family members who sat watching her with expressions of guilt and dawning recognition. "What I discovered instead was a family that measured love in terms of financial contribution and loyalty in terms of unquestioning compliance with established hierarchies. But rather than fight against those values or attempt to change them, I decided to meet them on their own terms." Helena's voice gained strength as she continued. "Over the past 16 years, I have provided financial assistance to virtually every member of the Blackwood family during their times of crisis. I saved Theodore's construction company from bankruptcy with a $250,000 loan. I paid for Cordelia's emergency medical expenses when insurance coverage was denied. I co-signed Vincent's restaurant equipment loan when banks refused to provide financing 2 days before his opening. I provided emergency mortgage financing to save Reginald's shopping center from foreclosure." The courtroom listened in absolute silence as Helena methodically recounted years of quiet generosity. "But I didn't provide this assistance because I wanted to buy my way into the family or because I expected gratitude or recognition in return. I provided it because these were people my husband loved and their well-being mattered to him, which meant it mattered to me." Helena turned slightly to address the family directly. Every time I offered help, I asked that we keep the arrangements private. I did this not because I was ashamed of helping, but because I understood that accepting assistance from someone they had never fully accepted as family would be difficult for people who prided themselves on their independence and self-sufficiency. Her voice took on a note of sadness that hadn't been present before. What I didn't anticipate was that this discretion would eventually be used against me. That the very generosity I had hoped would demonstrate my commitment to this family would be forgotten or reinterpreted as manipulation when it became convenient to paint me as an outsider who had never contributed anything of value. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, her attention completely focused on Helena's testimony. Mrs. Vasquez, can you help the court understand why you documented these financial arrangements so thoroughly? Helena nodded thoughtfully. Your Honor, I'm a trained accountant and business manager. Documentation is second nature to me, both professionally and personally. But more importantly, I learned early in my marriage that the Blackwood family had a tendency to rewrite history when it suited their purposes. I began keeping detailed records not because I planned to use them against anyone, but because I wanted to protect both myself and them from future misunderstandings about our financial relationships. She returned her attention to the family members, her voice gentle but firm. I never intended for these private arrangements to become public knowledge. I had hoped that when this marriage ended, as I began to suspect it eventually would, we could part ways with dignity and mutual respect. But when Marcus convinced you to come here today and testify about my character, when you agreed to paint me as a calculating manipulator who had never contributed anything positive to this family, you forced me to defend myself with the only evidence I had, the truth. Helena walked closer to the family section of the courtroom, her presence commanding but not threatening. Theodore, when your company was facing bankruptcy, I didn't hesitate to risk my personal savings to help you because I knew how much the business meant to Marcus. Cordelia, when you were facing that medical crisis, I paid your bills because I couldn't bear the thought of you suffering due to insurance technicalities. Vincent, when your restaurant dream was about to collapse, I co-signed that loan because I saw how much your success meant to the entire family. Her voice began to break slightly, revealing the emotional toll of the day's revelations. Each time I helped, I did so gladly and without reservation. But when you took the witness stand today to describe me as someone who had taken advantage of your family's generosity without giving anything in return, you broke something inside me that I'm not sure can be repaired. The silence in the courtroom was profound. Several family members were openly crying, their faces reflecting the shame of people who had been forced to confront the magnitude of their own ingratitude and betrayal. Helena turned back to Judge Hendricks, her composure returning. Your Honor, I'm not asking this court to award me anything beyond what is fair and legal. I'm not seeking revenge or vindication. But I am asking that the record reflect the truth about my character and my contributions to this family. The loans I made were genuine expressions of love and support, not calculated investments in future manipulation. The discretion I requested was meant to preserve dignity, not to create opportunities for future deception. Judge Hendricks nodded slowly, her expression reflecting both admiration and concern. Mrs. Vasquez, the court appreciates your candor and your obvious efforts to protect family relationships even in the face of considerable provocation. Mr. Sterling, do you wish to present closing arguments for your client? Sterling rose reluctantly, clearly recognizing that any attempt to rehabilitate his case would only make matters worse. Your Honor, in light of the testimony we've heard today, I believe it would be appropriate for my client and his family to take some time to reconsider their positions regarding these proceedings. Judge Hendricks consulted her notes before addressing the courtroom. This court has rarely witnessed such a dramatic reversal of testimony, and frankly, such a clear demonstration of character on all sides. Mrs. Vasquez, your preparation, your dignity, and your obvious efforts to preserve family relationships even under attack speak very well of your character. Mr. Blackwood's family members, your willingness to acknowledge the truth once it became clear, despite the embarrassment involved, suggests that you understand the gravity of what has occurred here today. The judge's expression grew more stern as she continued. However, this court is deeply troubled by what appears to have been a coordinated effort to present testimony that was at best incomplete and at worst deliberately misleading. The fact that multiple witnesses failed to disclose substantial financial obligations to Mrs. Vasquez while simultaneously characterizing her as someone who had taken advantage of family generosity borders on perjury. Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his chair while Marcus sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, seeming to finally understand the magnitude of what he had set in motion. Judge Hendricks continued with growing authority. This court finds Mrs. Vasquez to be credible, well-prepared, and deserving of significant consideration in the division of marital assets. Furthermore, the evidence suggests that her financial contributions to various family members over the years should be considered as factors that enhance rather than diminish her claim to marital property. During the brief recess that followed the judge's preliminary ruling, the Blackwood family surrounded Helena with expressions of remorse and attempts at explanation. Theodore approached her first, his voice heavy with regret and shame. "Helena, I don't know how to apologize for what we did today. Marcus told us you were planning to take advantage of the family, that you had been manipulating all of us for years. He convinced us that your questions and interest in family matters were part of some calculated plan to gain control of family assets." Cordelia joined her husband, tears streaming down her face. "We should have known better, dear. You've been nothing but generous and kind to all of us. When you paid for my surgery, you probably saved my life, and instead of gratitude, I repaid you with suspicion and hostility." Vincent stepped forward, his usual confidence completely absent. "Helena, I'm ashamed of what I said about you today. You saved my restaurant, and probably my marriage along with it. When the banks turned us down, and we thought we were going to lose everything, you stepped in without hesitation. You didn't even ask for anything in writing, just trusted that we would do the right thing eventually." One by one, family members approached to offer similar apologies and acknowledgments. Uncle Reginald spoke of the shopping center loan that had saved his business empire. Beatrice mentioned the help Helena had provided with Oliver's graduate school applications. Cousin Nathaniel detailed the business connections Helena had shared during his restaurant expansion. Even great-aunt Millicent, despite her frail condition, insisted on being wheeled over to express her gratitude for the medical care coordination Helena had arranged during several health scares. As the family members offered their apologies, Marcus sat alone at the plaintiff's table, watching his support system transform into character witnesses for the woman he had tried to destroy. The isolation was complete and devastating. The people he had counted on to validate his version of reality were instead acknowledging a debt of gratitude that made his accusations seem petty and vindictive. When court reconvened for final rulings, Judge Hendricks addressed the assembled parties with the authority of someone who had seen enough evidence to reach definitive conclusions. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, this court finds that Mrs. Vasquez has demonstrated exceptional character, financial responsibility, and commitment to family welfare throughout her marriage. The evidence suggests that rather than taking advantage of family generosity, she has been the primary source of financial stability for multiple family members during times of crisis. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and decisive. Helena was awarded a substantial portion of marital assets, including recognition of her contributions to various family members as factors that enhanced her claim to consideration. More importantly, the public record would forever reflect the truth about her character and her role in the Blackwood family's financial stability. As the proceedings concluded and the courtroom began to empty, Helena gathered her files with the same methodical precision she had displayed throughout the day. Family members continued to approach her, seeking forgiveness and expressing gratitude that had been too long delayed. Marcus finally approached her as she prepared to leave. "Helena," he said quietly, "I think I've made a terrible mistake. My family has helped me understand how wrong I was about your motivations and your character." Helena looked at her husband with an expression that might have been sadness or pity or both. "Marcus," she replied gently, "the mistake wasn't in what you believed about me. The mistake was in forgetting who I actually am and what I've always been willing to do for the people I love." As Helena walked out of the courthouse, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had been vindicated completely but took no pleasure in the defeat of people she had once considered family. The morning's isolation had been replaced by acknowledgement and respect, but at a cost that would forever change the relationships involved. In the months that followed, family members reached out repeatedly to Helena, seeking to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by misunderstanding and manipulation. Some succeeded in establishing new foundations based on honesty and mutual respect. Others found that trust, once broken so completely, proved impossible to fully restore. Marcus faced the consequences of his actions largely alone. The family members who had supported his case gradually distanced themselves as they came to understand the full extent of Helena's generosity and their own ingratitude. The man who had brought an army to court found himself isolated by the very people he had counted on for support. But perhaps the most lasting impact was the lesson learned by everyone involved about the danger of allowing resentment and misunderstanding to override gratitude and truth. Helena's quiet strength and thorough preparation had not only vindicated her character, but had forced an entire family to confront the reality of their own behavior and values. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when everyone around you had already decided who you were supposed to be? Share your thoughts in the comments about how this story of hidden strength and patient justice resonated with you. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't anger or revenge, but simply the quiet presentation of truth and the dignity to let that truth speak for itself.